My name is Nathaniel Clark, and back in 2015, I found myself deep in the heart of the Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. I was there to escape the noise of city life, thinking a week of solitude might do me some good. Funny how I thought trading honking horns for howling winds was a smart move. I had always been an outdoorsy type, or at least that's what my dating profile said. Truth be told, the closest I'd been to roughing it was a weekend at a lakeside cabin with Wi-Fi and a fully stocked fridge. But after a rough breakup and a particularly brutal week at work, I decided it was time to reconnect with nature, or at least give it a firm handshake. The ranger station had been nearly empty when I'd checked in, manned by a weathered old-timer named Reed whose eyes held the kind of thousand-yard stare you see in war veterans. When I'd mentioned my plans to explore the more remote areas, his expression had darkened considerably. "Stick to the marked trails," he'd said, his voice carrying an odd tremor. "And whatever you do, don't go wandering around after dark. These woods, they ain't what they used to be." I'd laughed it off then, assuming he was just trying to scare the city boy. Now I wish I'd paid more attention to the fear that flickered behind his eyes, the way his weathered hands shook slightly as he handed me the trail maps. The first couple of days were uneventful. I hiked along well-marked trails, took pictures of anything that looked remotely scenic, and tried to convince myself that instant oatmeal was a suitable substitute for real food. I even attempted to start a campfire without using a lighter, which resulted in nothing but blisters and a newfound respect for modern technology. But something felt wrong from the very beginning. The forest was too quiet. Birds would stop singing when I approached, and I'd catch glimpses of small animals fleeing deeper into the woods as if something had spooked them long before I arrived. The shadows seemed to move independently of the wind, and more than once I found myself checking over my shoulder, certain I was being watched. On the second night, I'd been awakened by a sound I couldn't quite identify, a wet, scraping noise like something large dragging itself across the forest floor. I'd lain in my tent, barely breathing, listening as whatever it was circled my campsite. The scraping was accompanied by a rhythmic panting that didn't sound like any animal I knew. When morning came, I found deep gouges in the earth around my tent, gouges that looked suspiciously like claw marks. By the third day, my nerves were frayed. Sleep had become elusive, and every shadow held potential menace. That's when I decided to venture further off the beaten path, thinking that perhaps finding something tangible to explain my unease would settle my nerves. I stumbled upon an old trail that wasn't on any of the maps I had. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, overgrown with weeds and framed by towering pines that seemed to lean in just a bit too close. The trees along this forgotten path were different from the others. Their bark was scarred with deep scratches, and many bore strange symbols carved into their trunks, crude markings that looked almost ritualistic. Some trees were completely stripped of bark in spiral patterns, as if something with enormous claws had wound its way around them. The air felt heavier here, thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and wrong. "Adventure awaits," I muttered to myself, trying to sound enthusiastic. In hindsight, I should have turned back right then. But curiosity has a way of nudging you forward, much like how my mother nudges me about grandkids. As I walked, the forest grew denser. The sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an eerie silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes you check over your shoulder every few minutes. The canopy above grew so thick that very little sunlight penetrated, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks on the eyes. Shapes seemed to move in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my city nerves. "Get a grip, Nate," I whispered. "You're probably the scariest thing out here." Not my best pep talk, but it was all I had. About an hour in, I came across something strange, a clearing with a dilapidated cabin. It looked ancient, like it had been abandoned decades ago. The windows were shattered, the door hung off its hinges, and the wood was warped and rotten. But what struck me most was how wrong it looked in this setting. The cabin seemed to have been built without any regard for the natural flow of the land, as if whoever constructed it had been in a hurry or hadn't cared about the consequences of their intrusion. For reasons I can't quite explain, I felt compelled to check it out, Maybe I was hoping to find some rustic charm, or at least a good story to tell at parties. As I approached, a foul smell hit me, something pungent, metallic, and unmistakably rotten. The stench was so overwhelming that my eyes began to water, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. I covered my nose and hesitated. Probably just a dead animal, I thought, trying to convince myself. But as I peeked inside, I realized I was half right. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and scattered debris. But what caught my eye, or rather turned my stomach, were the remains of several animals strewn across the floor. Bones picked clean, some still with bits of flesh clinging on. The scene inside the cabin was far worse than I'd initially perceived. This wasn't the random carnage of a predator's feeding. This was systematic, almost ritualistic. Animal skulls were arranged in precise patterns along the walls, some stacked in pyramids, others hanging from the rafters on lengths of what looked suspiciously like human hair. The bones weren't just scattered, they were sorted by type and size, as if someone had been conducting some kind of grotesque inventory. I stepped inside, morbid fascination overriding my better judgment. The floorboards creaked ominously under my weight, and in several places, they had rotted through completely, revealing a crawl space beneath that reeked of death. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I noticed more disturbing details. The walls were covered in scratches that formed crude symbols and drawings, stick figures in various poses of agony, spiral patterns that hurt to look at directly, and what appeared to be a crude map of the surrounding forest with certain areas marked with dark stains. In one corner, I found a journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was barely legible, written in what looked like dried blood. The entries I could make out were rambling accounts of communion with the old ones, and feeding the hunger that dwells in shadow. One passage made my blood run cold. The beast grows stronger with each offering. Soon, it will no longer need to hide in the deep places. Soon, it will walk freely among them. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks ago. I stepped back, feeling a wave of nausea. The metallic smell was getting stronger, and I noticed dark stains on the floor that were definitely not from animal blood alone. Pieces of clothing, a hiking boot here, a torn jacket there, were scattered among the bones. These weren't just animal remains. Well, that's enough National Geographic for one day, I mumbled, eager to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere beneath the cabin. The sound was deep and resonant, seeming to come from the very earth itself. The floorboards beneath my feet began to vibrate slightly, and the growling grew louder. Something was moving in the crawl space, something large. I could hear it scraping against the wooden supports, the sound of claws on wood mixing with heavy, labored breathing. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling as whatever was below began to move more violently. I ran. I retraced my steps, but after a few minutes, I realized the path I had taken was nowhere to be found. Trees that looked familiar led to places that didn't. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing like some twisted maze. Every landmark I tried to use, a distinctive boulder, a fallen log, an unusually shaped tree, seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Panic started to set in. I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun aimlessly, as if the magnetic field itself was distorted. Perfect. Lost in the woods with a faulty compass. Just my luck. The sun was setting faster than it should have been, the shadows lengthening at an unnatural rate. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. As darkness crept through the forest, I began to notice other things, sounds that didn't belong. There was a rhythmic scratching coming from the trees above, as if something was carving symbols into the bark. Occasionally, I'd hear what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize, the voices seeming to come from just out of sight. Most disturbing of all were the wet, sliding sounds that seemed to follow me as I walked, as if something was dragging itself through the underbrush parallel to my path. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the shadows stretched longer, and the temperature dropped. I tried to stay calm, reminding myself that people get lost in the woods all the time and make it out just fine. Besides, I joke to no one, Bear Grylls made a career out of it. Maybe I'll get a TV deal out of this. But even as I tried to maintain my humor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded. Every time I tried to change direction, I'd encounter an impassable thicket or a steep ravine that forced me back onto what seemed like a predetermined path. It was as if the forest itself was guiding me somewhere, and I had a sinking feeling that wherever I was being led, it wasn't going to be pleasant. I decided to keep moving, hoping to find a landmark, or, at the very least, a cell signal. As darkness enveloped the forest, I heard something, a distant rustling followed by a low huffing sound. Probably just a deer, I told myself. Or a raccoon. Or any number of harmless woodland creatures that wouldn't mind sharing their GPS coordinates. But the sounds grew closer, more deliberate. Twigs snapped under heavy footsteps, and leaves crunched with each movement. The rhythm was wrong for any normal animal, too measured, too purposeful. It was the sound of something that was hunting. I picked up the pace, my heart pounding louder than my footsteps. The beam of my flashlight danced erratically as my hands shook, creating a frenzied light show that only made the shadows seem more menacing. Behind me, I could hear the steady pursuit, the creature, whatever it was, maintaining a perfect distance, close enough to keep me moving but far enough away to remain hidden. Suddenly, a figure darted between the trees ahead, a large, hulking shape that moved with unnatural speed. It was too big to be a deer and too swift to be a bear. The creature moved with a fluid grace that was completely at odds with its massive size, appearing and disappearing between the trees like a nightmare made flesh. "Hello?" I called out, instantly regretting it. My voice echoed through the forest, but there was something wrong with the echo. It seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, and when it finally faded, it was replaced by a silence so complete it was almost oppressive. Then came the response, a guttural snarl, not like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deep, resonant, and sent a chill down my spine. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions at once, as if it was bouncing off the trees and multiplying. Mixed in with the snarl was something that sounded almost like laughter, a wet, gurgling sound that spoke of intelligence far more terrifying than simple animal instinct. I broke into a run, branches whipping against my face as I barreled through the underbrush. Behind me, the footsteps quickened. Whatever it was following me, and it was fast. But worse than the speed was the playfulness I could sense in its pursuit. This wasn't the desperate hunt of a hungry predator. This was the leisurely chase of something that was enjoying itself. I glanced back and caught a glimpse of it, a massive creature covered in matted fur, muscles rippling under its hide. It moved on all fours but had a gait that seemed almost wrong, like it could switch to two legs at any moment. Its eyes reflected my flashlight beam, glowing like twin coals in the darkness. But what terrified me most was its face, too intelligent, too aware. This wasn't just an animal. This was something that understood what it was doing. The creature would occasionally let out sounds that were almost words, guttural vocalizations that seemed to carry meaning. It was toying with me, letting me run just far enough to think I might escape before appearing again to remind me that I was still very much its prey. Desperation kicked in. I veered off to the right, hoping to throw it off. Up ahead, I saw a fallen tree bridging a shallow ravine. Without thinking, I dashed across it. Halfway over, the trunk started to wobble. The wood was rotten, and my weight was more than it could bear. I leaped to the other side just as the log gave way, crashing into the rocky stream below. I allowed myself a moment to breathe, but it was short-lived. The creature appeared on the opposite bank, its eyes locked onto me. In the dim light, I could make out its features more clearly, a snout like a wolf, but broader, with teeth that seemed too large for its mouth. Its ears were too pointed, too mobile, constantly swiveling to track sounds I couldn't hear. Most disturbing of all were its hands, for they were hands, not paws, complete with opposable thumbs and fingers that ended in razor-sharp claws. "Not good, not good," I whispered, backing away slowly. The creature studied me for a moment, tilting its head in an almost human gesture of curiosity. Then it smiled, actually smiled, revealing rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's mouth rather than a land animal's. It let out a roar, a sound so fierce it vibrated in my chest and seemed to shake the very trees around us. But there was something else in that roar, something that sounded disturbingly like words. As impossible as it seemed, I could swear it had said my name. I turned and ran again, my lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. The creature's laughter followed me through the forest, a sound that somehow managed to be both behind me and ahead of me at the same time. I realized with growing horror that it was hurting me again, driving me towards some predetermined destination. I stumbled upon a narrow cave entrance, barely visible behind a curtain of ivy. Without options, I squeezed inside, pressing myself against the cold stone. The cave was shallow, offering little protection, but it was all I had. The creature approached, sniffing the air. I could hear it prowling outside, its claws scraping against the rocks. Each scrape sent shivers down my spine, the sound like fingernails on a chalkboard magnified tenfold. It let out a series of huffs, and for a moment I thought it might move on. Then, a massive arm reached into the cave, claws raking the space where my head had been moments before. The arm was impossibly long, covered in coarse black fur that seemed to absorb what little light filtered into the cave. The claws were the size of railroad spikes, yellowed with age and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. As the creature probed the cave, I could smell its breath, the stench of rotting meat and something else, something that reminded me of sulfur and decay. I flattened myself against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. It couldn't reach me, but it wasn't giving up. The creature began clawing at the entrance, widening the gap inch by inch. Stones crumbled, and dust filled the air. Each strike of its claws sent vibrations through the rock that I could feel in my bones. Between the scraping and clawing, I could hear it making sounds, not growls or snarls, but something that sounded disturbingly like speech. The words were in no language I recognized, but the cadence was unmistakably that of communication. It was talking to something, or perhaps to itself, discussing what it was going to do with me. I frantically searched the cave for anything I could use. My hands closed around a hefty rock, its surface rough and sharp. As the creature's head started to push through the opening, I could see it more clearly than ever before. Its face was a grotesque hybrid of human and beast, intelligent eyes set in a skull that was elongated like a wolf's but with distinctly human characteristics. Its nose was broad and flat, constantly flaring as it scented the air, and when it opened its mouth, I could see that its teeth were arranged in multiple rows like a shark's. As its head pushed through the entrance, I swung the rock with every ounce of strength I had. It connected with a sickening thud, and the creature recoiled, letting out a pained howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cave. Dark blood, almost black in the dim light, splattered across the cave walls. But instead of being deterred, the creature seemed almost pleased by my resistance. Its howl transformed into that same wet laughter I'd heard before, and it redoubled its efforts to reach me. The blood from its wound dripped onto the cave floor, and where it landed, the stone began to smoke and hiss as if the blood itself was acidic. Seizing the moment, I scrambled out of the cave, darting past the stunned beast. It swiped at me, catching the sleeve of my jacket and tearing it clean off. The claws passed so close to my skin that I could feel the air displaced by their passage. As I ran, I could hear the creature behind me, not pursuing with the same relentless intensity as before, but following at a distance, as if it was driving me towards something. Adrenaline surged through me as I sprinted through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The trees seemed to part before me, creating a clear path that led inexorably forward. In my panic state, I didn't realize that this was wrong, that forests don't naturally create such obvious passages. Up ahead, I saw lights flickering between the trees, a campsite. Relief flooded through me as I recognized the familiar orange glow of a campfire. There were people, safety, an end to this nightmare. Bursting into the clearing, I startled a group of hikers gathered around the fire. "Help! There's something out there!" I shouted, my voice ragged and desperate. They looked at me with faces etched with confusion and concern, taking in my torn clothes, bleeding scratches, and wild eyes. Whoa, slow down, said one of them, a middle-aged woman with graying hair. What happened to you? Before I could respond, the creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing. But now, in the full light of the fire, I could see it wasn't alone. Other shapes moved in the darkness beyond the firelight. At least 3 more creatures, maybe more. They had surrounded the campsite, and I realized with growing horror that this wasn't a rescue. This was a trap. The hikers gasped, and one of them fumbled for a flashlight, shining it directly at the nearest beast. In the full light, it was even more terrifying, a towering figure with the muscular build of a predator and the wild intelligence of something far more dangerous than any animal. Its fur was dark and matted, and its jaws were lined with sharp teeth glistening with saliva. What are those things?" whispered one of the hikers, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20. But the creatures weren't advancing. They were waiting, watching, as if they were following some kind of plan. The largest one, the one I'd encountered first, stepped into the firelight. In the flickering glow, I could see scars covering its body, old wounds that spoke of countless hunts and battles. This was an apex predator, something that had never known fear. One of the hikers pulled out a flare gun. Why he had one, I didn't question. The red light of the flare painted the clearing in hellish shadows as he aimed it at the largest creature. "Stay back!" he shouted, but his voice cracked with terror. The creature tilted its head, studying the weapon with what looked like amusement. Then it spoke, actually spoke, in a voice like gravel being ground together. "Fire hurts, but does not kill." The flare gun fired with a sharp crack, the projectile streaking through the air to strike the creature's shoulder. The flare embedded itself in the beast's fur, igniting the coarse hair and spreading flames across its massive frame. The stench of burning hair and flesh filled the air, mixed with something else, something chemical and wrong, as if the creature's very biology was alien. The beast let out a deafening roar, thrashing wildly as flames spread across its body. But instead of fleeing or collapsing, it seemed to grow larger, more terrible. The fire illuminated its features more clearly than ever before, revealing details that defied comprehension. Its skin beneath the fur was scarred with symbols similar to those I'd seen in the cabin, and the wounds from the flare were already beginning to heal, the flesh knitting itself back together with visible speed. "Move! Now!" another hiker shouted, but as we turned to run, we discovered that the other creatures had closed the circle. They emerged from the darkness like nightmares made flesh, each one unique in its own horrifying way. One had elongated arms that dragged on the ground, ending in hands that were more like spiders than anything mammalian. Another moved with a disturbing sideways gait, its joints bending in directions that defied anatomy. The group scattered, running toward the vehicles parked nearby, but the creatures moved to intercept us with coordinated precision. This wasn't random animal behavior. This was a pack hunt executed with military efficiency. They had planned this, waited for us to gather in one place where we'd be easy to contain. I jumped into the back of a pickup truck just as the engine roared to life. The driver, a middle-aged man with a graying beard, gunned the engine, tires spinning in the dirt as we lurched forward. But as we sped away, I could hear screams from behind us. Not everyone had made it to the vehicles. "What in God's name was that?" the driver asked, his voice shaking as he gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. I shook my head, still trying to process everything. "I have no idea," I replied. "But I think we just ruined its evening." Another passenger, a woman who had managed to jump into the truck bed with me, chuckled nervously, but the sound died in her throat as we heard something that chilled us to the bone, a coordinated howl that rose from multiple creatures, a sound that spoke of communication, planning, and an intelligence that was far too human for comfort. "Well, remind me to leave a bad review for this campground," she whispered. 0 stars for monstrous wildlife. We reached the nearest ranger station and reported the incident. They looked skeptical but sent out a team to investigate. Reed was there, his face grave as he listened to our account. When we finished, he just nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. "How many did you see?" he asked quietly. "At least 4, maybe 5. I replied. But there could have been more in the shadows. Reed's expression darkened further. They're getting bolder, he muttered, almost to himself. Usually they stay deeper in the forest, pick off lone hikers. They've never attacked a group this size before. What are you talking about? The driver demanded. What are those things? Reed was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window into the darkness. Things that should have stayed buried, he finally said. Things that were sleeping until someone started feeding them. Hours later, the search team returned with grim expressions. They had found the burned remains of something large at the campsite, but it wasn't the creature I'd seen shot with the flare. This was something else entirely, older, more decomposed, as if it had been dead for weeks but had somehow been moving around anyway. They also found evidence of the other hikers who hadn't made it to the vehicles. The remains were incomplete, arranged in the same ritualistic patterns I'd seen in the cabin, as if the creatures were following some kind of ancient protocol. Over the next few days, news spread about unexplained animal attacks in the area. Authorities chalked it up to a rogue bear, advising everyone to steer clear of the forest until they could ensure safety. But the attacks continued, spreading outward from the forest in an ever-widening circle. Each incident was more gruesome than the last, and the pattern was always the same: victims found arranged in ceremonial poses, bones picked clean with surgical precision. I knew better. Whatever those creatures were, they weren't bears. And they weren't alone. The thing I'd encountered in the forest was just one of many, and from what Reed had said, they were growing stronger. I left South Dakota, vowing to stick to city parks from then on. A swing set and a hot dog stand sounded a lot more appealing than anything the wilderness had to offer. But even as I tried to put distance between myself and the Black Hills, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. A few weeks later, I stumbled upon an old newspaper article detailing local legends of shape-shifting creatures that roamed the Black Hills, tales dismissed as folklore by modern authorities. The article mentioned a settlement that had disappeared in the 1800s, leaving behind only empty buildings and strange symbols carved into the trees. Investigators at the time had found evidence of ritualistic activity, but the case was quietly closed and the files sealed. But legends have to start somewhere, don't they? The article included a photograph of symbols found at the abandoned settlement. They were identical to the ones I'd seen carved into the trees and scratched into the walls of the cabin. At the bottom of the article, in small print, was a note that made my blood run cold. Similar symbols have been reported appearing throughout the Black Hills area in recent years, often accompanied by unexplained disappearances and animal attacks. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but I couldn't forget Reed's words about things that should have stayed buried. Something was waking up in those woods, something that had been sleeping for a very long time. And I had a terrible suspicion that my encounter with the creatures was just the beginning. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something is watching me from the shadows. I've moved 3 times since leaving South Dakota, but no matter where I go, I can't shake the sensation that those intelligent, predatory eyes are still following me. The worst part is the dreams. In them, I'm back in that forest, but this time I'm not running. I'm walking calmly through the trees, following a path that leads deeper and deeper into the darkness. And in the distance, I can hear them calling my name, their voices mixing together in a harmony that sounds almost like singing. Sometimes, when I wake up from those dreams, I find mud on my shoes and pine needles in my hair. And I have to fight the urge to start driving west, back toward the Black Hills, back toward whatever is waiting for me in those ancient, hungry woods. Because deep down, I know the truth that I don't want to admit. They didn't let me escape that night. They let me go. And someday, when the time is right, they're going to call me home. My cousin Aidan had just finished building a cabin way out in the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere in western North Carolina, about 20 miles from the nearest speck on the map. Even calling it a town felt generous. It had a post office, a gas station with one pump that Eugene, the ancient attendant who'd been there since the 70s, operated with arthritic hands, and a diner that closed at 4. That was about it. No cell reception past a certain point, No power lines once you left the highway, and definitely no Wi-Fi. Just forest, nothing but trees and hills in every direction. Trees that had stood for centuries, their roots tangled deep in soil that had never known a plow. The kind of old-growth forest that made you feel like an intruder, like the trees themselves were watching, waiting for you to make a wrong turn and disappear forever into their depths. Aiden had gone through a messy divorce the year before, and he sort of snapped in a quiet way. Sienna, his ex-wife, had taken everything, the house, the car, even his grandmother's china. One day he just announced he was done with cities, with traffic, with bills, with people. Said he wanted to live close to the bone. That was the kind of thing he said when he made up his mind. He bought a patch of forest from some local who was eager to sell. Too eager, I thought later. The land had been in the seller's family for generations, but he practically threw the deed at Aiden when he showed interest. "Just don't go past the ridge," the man had muttered, not meeting Aiden's eyes. "And stay away from the old trails. Some of them, they don't lead anywhere good." Aiden taught himself to build with his hands, ordered books on cabin construction, spent hours watching YouTube tutorials before the internet became a distant memory. Then he vanished for 6 months. The next I heard, he'd put up a cabin himself, off-grid, solar-powered, wood-heated. The whole thing. When it was done, he offered it to me for a week. Said he'd be out of state for work and figured I could use the time to write or clear my head. I hadn't told him I needed to clear anything, but I guess it showed. The nightmares had been getting worse, shadows at the edge of my vision, the feeling of being watched even in my locked apartment. Maybe some time in nature would help. I made the drive on a Tuesday morning. It was a clear day, not too hot, and the kind of quiet that starts pressing on your ears the farther you get from people. The road narrowed gradually. Asphalt gave way to gravel. Gravel turned into dirt. The GPS lost signal around mile marker 47, right where the forest seemed to close in like a living wall. Eventually, I found myself crawling along a rut-ridden trail barely wide enough for my car. The trees here were different from the ones near the highway. These were ancient things, their bark black with age and moisture, twisted into shapes that looked almost deliberate. Some had hollows that resembled screaming mouths. Others had grown together, fused into grotesque embraces that had lasted centuries. Spanish moss hung from branches like funeral shrouds, and the air smelled of decay, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a vase. At a certain point, I gave up, parked in a grassy clearing where the ground was soft and spongy, almost breathing under my feet. The walk to the cabin was maybe half a mile, but it felt longer. A duffel over one shoulder, a cooler banging against my leg, each step taking me deeper into something that felt fundamentally wrong. The trail was marked only by small notches in trees, Aiden's work, clearly, but even those seemed to fade in and out of visibility, as if the forest was trying to reclaim them. I passed a deer carcass about halfway there. It had been torn open, but not by any predator I recognized. The wounds were too clean, too deliberate. Its eyes were missing, the sockets dark and perfectly round. Flies buzzed in lazy circles, but even they seemed reluctant to land. The cabin was tucked into the hillside like it was hiding. Like it had always been there, waiting. The front porch looked out over a steep drop into a hollow thick with trees so dense you couldn't see the ground. The back was so close to the slope you could reach out a window and touch the undergrowth that rustled even when there was no wind. It wasn't big, but it looked solid. Hand-cut siding already weathering to match the trees around it, a deep porch with 2 chairs that faced the hollow, a big iron stove squatting in the middle of the main room like some kind of altar. Inside was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, just quiet. That weird pressing silence that settles in when there's no hum of electricity, no fridge, no AC, no Wi-Fi router clicking, just air and wood and your own breathing. And something else. A smell underneath the wood and dust. Something organic and wrong, like meat left in the sun. I searched the cabin twice but found nothing. Aiden had left a note on the counter, scribbled in Sharpie on a folded piece of notebook paper. Try the trail behind the fire pit. It leads to a stream. Preston went that way last month looking for it. Never said what he saw, but he left the county the next day. Eugene at the gas station says the old-timers won't go near those trails after dark. Something about the moonless nights being hungry. No one out here but deer and ghosts. Enjoy the quiet. P.S. If you hear screaming, it's just the mountain. That's what they tell me, anyway. That was it. I stood there for a second holding the note, listening to the silence that wasn't really silence at all. Underneath it, barely audible, was a sound like breathing. Not mine. Something deeper, older, coming from the walls themselves. The first day passed slowly, like time itself was different here. Thicker. I didn't even open my laptop. My brain was too loud at first, like it was trying to fill the silence with every thought I'd been pushing down. But there was something else, a frequency in the air that made thinking feel like swimming through tar. The walls of the cabin seemed to pulse slightly if you looked at them too long, a barely perceptible expansion and contraction that matched no rhythm I could identify. Eventually, I gave up trying to be productive, and just wandered. The cabin was simple. One main room with the stove, a small bedroom with a cot that smelled of mildew and something else, something animal, and a bathroom that was basically an outhouse with pretensions. But there were details that didn't make sense. Scratches on the inside of the door, too high to be made by any animal. A dark stain on the floorboards near the stove that wouldn't come clean no matter how hard I scrubbed. And the windows, all of them had been reinforced from the inside with extra locks. Aiden had installed bars that could be dropped into place, turning each window into a miniature prison cell. I built a fire in the stove as evening approached, fed it with wood from the pile outside. The logs were damp and gave off too much smoke, filling the cabin with a greasy haze that made my eyes water. But I didn't dare open the windows. Not after seeing those locks. I made pouch chili on the camp stove, ate mechanically while watching the darkness creep up from the hollow like flood water. Saturday on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, I watched the trees shift from green to black as night fell. But they didn't just darken, they transformed. Shapes that had been merely unsettling in daylight became monstrous in shadow. Branches became arms. Knots became faces. And everywhere, that feeling of being observed by something that had been watching long before humans walked these hills. The night sounds started around 9. Not normal forest sounds, no owls, no crickets, no rustling of small creatures. Instead, there were footsteps. Slow, measured, circling the cabin at a distance. They'd pause occasionally, and in those pauses, I could hear breathing. Deep, rattling breaths that sounded wrong, like they were coming through a throat not meant for air. I went to bed early, just to escape the quiet and the not quiet. But sleep wouldn't come easy. The cot creaked with every movement, and the darkness in the bedroom was absolute. No street lights, no moon through the clouds, just black so thick it had weight. And in that darkness, shapes moved. Not outside, inside. Shadows that shouldn't exist without light, sliding across the walls like oil. Around midnight, I heard the first knock. Soft, tentative, like someone testing if anyone was home. It came from the east wall, the one closest to the slope. I lay frozen, every muscle locked. The knock came again, harder. Then nothing for an hour. Then a scraping sound, like fingernails on wood, that went on for 5 minutes before stopping abruptly. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there listening to the cabin settle. Except cabins don't settle with footsteps above you when there's no second floor. By the second day, my body had caught up with my brain's exhaustion. I slept late, probably the first deep sleep I'd had in months, though my dreams were filled with twisted trees and faces and bark. I woke to find the front door slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked and barred it. No wind could have opened it. The bar had been lifted and carefully placed to the side. Made coffee on the little propane burner Aiden had left, trying to ignore the handprints on the outside of the windows, handprints that were too large and had too many fingers. Curled up on the floor by the stove, I read for hours, though I kept having to reread passages. The words seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. By the time the sun started dipping, painting the hollow in shades of rust and blood, I was itching to move. Maybe it was cabin fever. Maybe it was the walls that seemed closer than they had that morning. Maybe it was the photograph I'd found tucked behind the stove, a Polaroid of Aiden standing with two other people, their faces scratched out with something sharp. One word written on the back in handwriting I didn't recognize. Chosen. I threw on my jacket and stepped outside. The air had that crisp, piney bite to it, clean in a way you only notice when you've lived too long surrounded by traffic and air conditioning. But underneath the pine was that other smell, sweet rot, getting stronger. The trail behind the fire pit wasn't obvious unless you were looking for it. It started as a soft dip in the brush, just a slightly darker path where the undergrowth had been walked down. No markers, no signs, no blaze marks on trees, just that gentle curve disappearing into the woods. But there were other signs. Strips of cloth tied to branches, so weathered they were almost invisible. Symbols carved into bark, not initials or hearts, but strange geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. I figured I'd follow it for a bit, see the stream Preston had gone looking for, then loop back before it got too dark. The sun was already low, sending long shadows through the trees like reaching fingers. The farther I walked, the quieter it got. And not just from going deeper into the woods. It was like the trees themselves were swallowing the sound. Even my footsteps felt muffled after a while, like I was walking on thick carpet instead of leaves and twigs. The trail narrowed until I had to duck under low-hanging branches and step over broken limbs, some of which looked freshly fallen. Some of which were arranged in patterns that looked almost like letters in an alphabet I didn't know. That's when I saw them. Two men. Maybe 300 feet off to my left, just standing in a shallow dip in the brush. They weren't moving, their backs slightly hunched, heads tilted forward at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for any normal person to hold. From a distance, it looked like they were staring at something on the ground. Except they weren't moving. At all. Not even the slight sway you get when someone's standing still. They were frozen, like someone had paused them mid-motion. I stopped and just stared. No orange vests, no gear. Definitely not hunters. Their clothes were wrong, old, but not vintage. Faded and mended and remended, like they'd been worn for decades without replacement. They didn't look like campers either. No backpacks, no water bottles. Just standing there, completely still, heads angled toward the dirt in perfect synchronization. The urge to call out died in my throat. Something primal, something that had kept my ancestors alive, told me that drawing their attention would be the last mistake I'd ever make. I kept moving, casual, steady, not fast, not sneaky, eyes on the trail ahead while every nerve screamed at me to run. My peripheral vision caught movement, or rather, the lack of it. They were tracking me without moving, their stillness somehow following my progress. I glanced back once. They hadn't moved an inch, but somehow they were facing my direction now. Still with their heads down, still utterly motionless, but oriented toward me like flowers following the sun. I told myself they were locals, maybe checking their moonshine stills or growing something they shouldn't be. Maybe they were high on something that made standing still seem like a good idea. Maybe they didn't see me. The brain will do whatever it can to make something strange feel normal. The trail kept going. I expected it to loop after a while, curve back toward the cabin, but it didn't. It just went deeper, narrower, darker, trees growing denser until the light barely trickled through. The symbols on the trees were more frequent now, and some were fresh, sap still weeping from the wounds. I'd gone too far, but turning back meant passing those men again. That's when I heard the scream. It sliced through the woods like it didn't care about direction or origin, shrill and low at the same time. Not human, but not any animal either. The closest I can describe is this warped metallic noise, like a speaker tearing itself apart, while playing a frequency that human ears weren't meant to process. It came from everywhere, above, below, from inside the trees themselves. My teeth ached. My vision blurred. Something warm trickled from my nose, blood. I stopped, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned slowly. They were on the trail behind me now, closer. Maybe 150 feet. Same posture, same dead stillness, but now I could see more details. Their hands hung wrong, too long, fingers bent at angles that suggested extra joints. And their faces. I still couldn't see their faces, but the shape of their heads was off. Too narrow, too elongated, like someone had grabbed a normal skull and pulled. I didn't run, but I walked fast. The trail suddenly felt different, longer, tighter, like the woods were leaning in around me. Every shadow looked like it could hold a face, or something wearing the approximation of one. Every turn felt like a trap closing. The trees seemed to multiply, paths that hadn't been there before branching off into darkness. I kept expecting them to reappear, maybe closer this time, maybe close enough to see what was wrong with their faces. They didn't. Not on the trail, anyway. When the cabin came into view, I nearly sobbed with relief. The last 100 yards were the longest of my life. I could feel eyes on me, not just 2 pairs, but dozens. The forest itself was watching, waiting to see if I'd make it to the illusory safety of 4 walls and a locked door. I slammed the door shut, locked it, dropped the bar into place. Then I stood in the middle of the room just listening. Nothing. Nothing but my own ragged breathing and the crackle of dying embers in the stove. I didn't call Aiden. Didn't even think about it. What would I say? Hey, some guys in the woods moved weird? There's something wrong with their proportions? The mountain screamed at me and made my nose bleed? I threw more wood into the stove, made tea with shaking hands, told myself it was just locals messing around. A prank on the city boy. A hazing ritual for outsiders. Some kind of mountain tradition I didn't understand. That scream, though. That stayed in my bones, reverberating through my skeleton like I'd become a tuning fork for something vast and hostile. About 30 minutes passed. I started to relax, picked up my book again, got a few pages in, almost convinced myself I'd imagined most of it. The mind plays tricks in isolation. The forest can make you paranoid. There were probably a dozen rational explanations for what I'd seen. Then it came again. That same scream. Distant this time, but unmistakable. Like something enormous twisting inside the trees, something that had been sleeping in the roots and rocks for millennia and was slowly, terribly, waking up. The windows rattled. A fine dust fell from the ceiling. One of the framed pictures Aiden had hung, a landscape of the mountain in autumn, fell from the wall and shattered. I stood up, walked to the back window, peeked out through a crack in the curtain. Nothing but black trees and the suggestion of movement, branches swaying without wind, shadows shifting without light. But there was a smell now, seeping through the walls. Copper and ozone, like the air before a lightning strike mixed with an abandoned slaughterhouse. I let the curtain fall and tried to search online for answers. Every combination I could think of. Appalachian scream, weird animal sounds, metallic forest noise, North Carolina mystery sound. I listened to clips of mountain lions, owls, coyotes, even foxes and elk. All of them wrong, too high-pitched, too biological. This was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. The search for Preston, North Carolina missing brought up a 3-line news item from 2 weeks ago. Local man, 28, leaves town suddenly, family concerned. No follow-up. No resolution. Then came the footsteps. Heavy. Slow. Deliberate. Boards creaking under boots. Or something pretending to wear boots. They circled the cabin once, twice, pausing at each window. I could hear breathing through the walls, wet and labored, like lungs full of fluid trying to remember how to process air. They stopped right outside the front door. A knock. Soft. Careful. The kind of knock that knows you're listening and wants you to know it knows. I stood frozen, the poker from beside the stove clutched in my sweaty grip. Another knock. Slower. Heavier. Like whoever was out there wanted me to know they weren't in a hurry. That they had all the time in the world. That the night was young and full of possibilities, none of them good. I edged toward the door, leaned in, looked through the peephole Aiden had installed. 2 figures. Same size, same build as the ones from the forest. But now they were wearing plastic animal masks. Crude ones, the kind you'd get from a dollar store Halloween display. one shaped like a deer with antlers that caught the moonlight. The other something rounder, a rabbit maybe, with long ears that flopped obscenely with each breath. White elastic bands stretched across the backs of their heads, pressing into hair that looked wet and stringy. Their hoods were up, casting their masked faces in shadow, but I could see their eyes through the holes. Too many eyes. Or eyes that were divided, fractured, like looking through a broken mirror. They didn't move. Just stood there, their breath fogging in the cold air in patterns that spelled out words and languages that predated speech. I backed away, gripped the poker tighter, crouched behind the couch like a child hiding from monsters that were supposed to stay under the bed. Then something hit the door. Hard. Just once. A deep splintering sound that echoed through the floor and up into my bones. The bar held, but barely. Wood dust drifted down from the point of impact. Then silence. Terrible, pregnant silence. Eventually, the footsteps started again. Retreating. When I dared to peek through the peephole, they were walking back into the woods, slowly, calmly, their movements synchronized like puppets on the same string. They disappeared down the trail, and the darkness swallowed them like water. But I could still feel them out there. Waiting. Planning. Preparing something worse. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every sound was them returning. Every silence was them already inside. I sat in the corner where I could see both the door and the windows, the poker across my lap, a kitchen knife within reach. The fire died to embers, but I didn't dare go outside for more wood. The darkness beyond the windows was absolute, and in it, I imagined shapes gathering, multiplying, pressing against the glass with faces that weren't quite faces. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started. Not at the door this time, but on the roof. Deliberate, rhythmic scratching, like someone, or something, was trying to carve symbols into the wood. It went on for an hour, stopped for 10 minutes, then started again on the north wall. By dawn, I was certain the entire cabin was covered in some kind of script, a message or a marking that designated it, and me, for something unspeakable. As soon as the sun came up, gray and weak through the cloudy sky, I grabbed my stuff. Didn't bother packing properly, just shoved everything into the duffel. My hands shook so badly I dropped the car keys twice. The morning air was thick with fog that hadn't been there the night before, fog that moved wrong, swirling in patterns that defied wind patterns. I hiked out faster than was safe, stumbling over roots, scratching my arms on branches that seemed to reach for me. The trail looked different in the morning light, or maybe it was different. Trees I didn't remember. Turns that hadn't been there before. And everywhere, that feeling of being watched, of being herded towards some predetermined destination. My car was where I'd left it, but it wasn't alone. Surrounding it in a perfect circle were footprints in the soft earth. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all facing inward like they'd stood there watching my car all night. Some of the prints were human. Others were wrong, too long, with toe marks that suggested claws or extra digits. I threw my stuff in the back, started the engine with a prayer of thanks when it turned over, and drove. Too fast for the narrow trail, bottoming out twice, scraping paint off both sides. I didn't care. I needed distance between me and whatever was in those woods. The gas station was open. Eugene was there, same as always, moving his arthritic hands over the register keys like a pianist playing a funeral dirge. He looked up when I came in, and something flickered in his rheumy eyes. "Leaving already?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Yeah. Emergency at home." He nodded slowly, rang up my gas and the coffee I grabbed. As he handed me the receipt, he gripped my wrist. His fingers were ice cold and stronger than they should have been. "They marked you," he said quietly. "I can smell it on you. The old ones? They don't usually let people leave once they've been marked." I yanked my hand away. "What are you talking about? Your cousin should have listened. Preston should have listened. That land, it was never meant for building. It belongs to them. Always has." He leaned closer, and his breath smelled of soil and decay. "They'll follow you now. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come. They always collect what's theirs." I backed out of the station, nearly knocking over a display of chips. Eugene watched me go, his face expressionless, his eyes reflecting something that wasn't quite human concern. I drove until the bars came back on my phone somewhere around mile marker 20. 12 missed calls. Aiden had tried to reach me twice. I called him back with shaking fingers. When I told him what happened, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "Which trail?" I told him. He let out a long breath that sounded like defeat. "I never cleared that one all the way," he said. "Didn't go more than halfway myself. Couldn't. The locals, they told me, they warned me." His voice trailed off. "Warned you about what?" "About the old families. The ones who made deals before the town was even built. Before the roads. Before maps. They don't." He struggled for words. "They wear the masks so you don't see what's underneath. What they've become. Or what they've always been. You knew? You knew and you let me stay there? I thought if you didn't go too far into the woods. I thought the cabin was safe. I put up protections, the iron, the symbols Eugene gave me. I thought. You thought wrong." Silence. Then, "You need to move. Don't stay in one place. They can follow the marked ones. Eugene's right about that. I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. I didn't know they'd come so soon. They usually wait for the new moon, for the hungry nights. The new moon is tomorrow," I said, checking my phone calendar with numb fingers. More silence. "Then you need to run. Now. Don't go home. Don't go anywhere you care about. Just run." He sold the cabin a few months later, claimed it was too much to maintain. But I heard something in his voice, something that said he'd seen things too. Maybe worse things. Things that came after the marked ones who stayed too long. I didn't go home. I drove to the airport instead, bought a ticket to the first city more than 1,000 miles away. I've been moving ever since. 6 months now. Different cities, different names, never more than a week in one place. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it. That metallic scream, distant but getting closer. Sometimes I catch a glimpse in my peripheral vision, 2 figures in animal masks standing at the edge of a parking lot, in the back of a restaurant, at the end of a hotel hallway. Standing still. Perfectly still. Waiting. Last week, I woke up to find footprints outside my motel room door. The same prints from around my car. And on the door, scratched in symbols that hurt to look at, a single word. Soon. Eugene was right. They always collect what's theirs. And I think my time is running out. The worst part isn't the fear. It's the dreams. Dreams where I'm back in those woods, but this time I'm the one wearing the mask. This time, I'm the one standing perfectly still in the forest, waiting for someone to walk by. Waiting to continue the cycle that started before the first roads were cut through those ancient mountains. Sometimes, in those dreams, I understand what the screaming means. It's not a warning. It's a call. A summoning. And every time I hear it, whether awake or asleep, something inside me wants to answer. The transformation has already begun. I can feel it in my bones, which ache and crack in ways they never did before. My fingers seem longer in the morning. My reflection doesn't always match my movements. Preston knew. That's why he ran. But running only delays the inevitable. They don't just mark you. They change you. And soon I'll be going home. Not to my apartment, or my family, but to those woods. To that cabin. To take my place among the still ones, the watchers, the collectors of the marked. I'm writing this as a warning. If you see a property for sale in the Appalachian Mountains, isolated and perfect and too cheap to be true, don't buy it. If locals warn you about trails, believe them. If you hear screaming that comes from everywhere and nowhere, run. And if you see figures in the woods wearing cheap animal masks, standing perfectly still, don't look at them. Don't acknowledge them. And whatever you do, don't follow them when they walk backward into the forest. Because they're not walking away. They're leading you home. My name is Kurt Linder, and in 1999, I was sent to the thick woods outside Missoula, Montana, where the Bitterroot Mountains hide more secrets than I'd ever wanted to know. The case file sat heavy in my hands as I drove the winding mountain roads. Another missing persons case. Another family torn apart by unanswered questions. But this one felt different from the moment I read the first line. Jesse Connors, 19 years old, University of Montana freshman. Last seen 2 weeks prior with a group the locals whispered about in hushed tones. The sheriff's department had been tight-lipped about the details, but I'd caught fragments of conversation in the hallways. Words like ritual and commune and not right in the head. Small-town gossip, maybe, but in my 15 years of detective work, I'd learned that small-town gossip often held grains of terrible truth. The autumn air bit at my face as I parked my sedan at the trailhead. Above me, the Bitterroot Mountains loomed like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in gray clouds that seemed to press down with unnatural weight. The forest stretched endlessly before me, a maze of lodgepole pines and Douglas firs that grew so thick they swallowed the daylight hours before noon. I'd handled missing persons cases before, plenty of them. Usually, they involved runaways seeking freedom from suffocating small towns, or hikers who'd underestimated the mountain's appetite for the unprepared. Those cases had solutions, patterns, logical conclusions. You followed the evidence, tracked the trail, and brought people home. This felt different. The silence that greeted me as I stepped into the tree line wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the silence of something holding its breath. The path Jesse's dorm mate had described started clear enough, a hiking trail marked with the occasional weathered sign. But after the first mile, the markers disappeared, and the trail became little more than animal tracks winding between massive tree trunks. The canopy above grew so dense that my flashlight became necessary even though sunset was still hours away. That's when I began noticing the signs that something was wrong. Carved symbols in the bark of trees, not the casual initials of teenage lovers, but deep, deliberate cuts that had healed into twisted scars. The symbols meant nothing to me, but they followed a pattern, appearing every few hundred yards like breadcrumbs leading deeper into darkness. The forest floor told stories too. Boot prints in the mud, all different sizes, but all heading in the same direction. Old campfire rings that had been used recently, the ashes still holding traces of more than wood. I knelt beside one and caught a whiff of something acrid, chemical, that made my throat burn. Mixed in with the ash were fragments of what looked like bone, too small to be human, I told myself, though I wasn't entirely convinced. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. Their branches formed a ceiling so thick that no rain had touched the ground in years, leaving the earth beneath my feet soft and treacherous. More than once, I stumbled into hidden holes or caught my foot on roots that seemed to reach up and grab at me with deliberate malice. The silence grew oppressive. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of dead leaves under my boots. It was as if every living thing had fled this place, or learned to hold perfectly still. Then I found the traps. The first one nearly caught my ankle, an old bear trap, its rusted jaws still spring-loaded and deadly. It was partially buried under a thin layer of leaves, positioned right in the middle of what appeared to be a game trail. I knelt to examine it more closely and felt my blood run cold. The metal teeth were stained with something dark, and caught between them were shreds of fabric that looked disturbingly familiar. Denim. Blue denim, faded and torn. Jesse had been wearing jeans when he disappeared. I marked the spot in my mind and continued forward, now watching every step. More traps appeared with disturbing frequency, some old and rusted, others that gleamed with recent maintenance. They weren't randomly placed. Someone had positioned them strategically, creating a gauntlet that funneled visitors toward a specific destination while weeding out the careless or unlucky. The thought that Jesse might have stumbled through this maze in the dark made my stomach clench. A 19-year-old kid, probably drunk or high, following new friends who'd promised him adventure. He wouldn't have seen the traps until it was too late. After 3 miles of careful navigation, I finally saw it through the trees, the cabin. It crouched in a small clearing like a malignant tumor, built from logs so dark they seemed to absorb what little light filtered through the canopy. The structure was larger than I'd expected, sprawling and asymmetrical as if it had grown organically over many years. Windows stared out from the walls like dead eyes, their glass so dirty it was impossible to see what lurked behind them. Several vehicles sat in the mud around the cabin, pickup trucks and an old van, all with flat tires and license plates so rusted they were illegible. They'd been here for years, slowly sinking into the earth and being reclaimed by the forest. Vines crept up their sides, and small trees grew through their rusted frames. But it was the smell that stopped me cold. Even at a distance of 50 yards, I caught the stench drifting from the cabin. It was the smell of death, not the clean death of a hunting kill, but something rotten and prolonged. Something that had been dying slowly, piece by piece. I checked my radio, knowing already what I'd find. No signal. The mountains and trees had cut me off from the outside world as effectively as if I'd traveled to another planet. Whatever happened here, I'd be facing it alone. Drawing my service weapon, I approached the cabin's front door. The cabin's front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated decay. Boards creaked ominously under my feet, and I noticed that several had been deliberately loosened, another trap for the unwary. Someone had taken great care to make this place as unwelcoming as possible, yet I could see clear signs of recent habitation. Fresh footprints in the mud, recently extinguished cigarette butts, the faint glow of lamplight behind one of the grimy windows. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing strangely in the oppressive silence. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, and heard movement from within, the scrape of a chair, whispered voices, the shuffle of multiple people moving carefully across wooden floors. They knew I was here. They were deciding what to do about it. When the door finally opened, I found myself face to face with a man who seemed to have been carved from the same dark wood as the cabin itself. Tall and gaunt, with skin the color of old leather and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. His hair hung in greasy strands around a face that was both ageless and ancient, as if he'd been living in these woods for decades. Behind him, I could see movement in the shadows, other figures hanging back in the darkness, watching. How many of them were there? The whispered voices had suggested at least 3 or 4, but the shadows seemed to shift and multiply, creating the illusion of a much larger group. "Sheriff's Department," I said, keeping my voice steady and professional. "I'm looking for a missing young man, name of Jesse Connors. Folks said he might be up this way." The man stared at me without blinking, his head tilted slightly to one side like a predator evaluating prey. When he finally spoke, his voice was like grinding stone. "Ain't seen no one by that name. Just us out here. Mind if I take a look around?" It wasn't really a question, and we both knew it. I was going to search this place whether he cooperated or not. But his response surprised me. "Wouldn't recommend it," he said, his lips pulling back in what might have been a smile. "Woods are dangerous at night. Easy to get lost. Easy to disappear." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Yet something in his manner suggested he wasn't entirely opposed to my presence. There was an anticipation in his eyes, as if he'd been waiting for someone like me to arrive. I pushed past him into the cabin's interior, my hand resting on my weapon. The inside was a study in controlled decay. The walls were lined with animal skulls, deer, elk, bear, and others I couldn't immediately identify. Some looked old, bleached white by years of exposure. Others were fresh enough that dried flesh still clung to the bone. But it was the symbols carved into every available surface that made my skin crawl. The same marks I'd seen on the trees covered the walls, carved deep into the wood, and filled with what looked like dried blood. They formed patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. I'd seen gang tags and prison tattoos, but these symbols carried a weight that pressed against my mind like a physical presence. "Interesting artwork," I said, gesturing at the walls. "Old ways," the man replied. "Older than your kind understand." My kind. The phrasing stuck with me as I continued my examination of the room. In one corner, Moldy blankets were piled high enough to suggest multiple occupants. A cold fireplace dominated another wall, its hearth stained black with years of use. The smell of burnt meat hung heavy in the air, though I couldn't see any recent cooking. But it was the narrow door at the back of the room that drew my attention. Unlike the rest of the cabin, it looked recently installed, with new hinges and a heavy deadbolt lock. "What's behind the door?" I asked. The man's eyes flicked toward it before returning to my face. "Storage. Nothing that would interest you." Everything about his body language screamed deception. The way he positioned himself between me and the door, the nervous twitch in his left eye, the subtle shift in his stance that suggested he was preparing to block my path. "I think there is," I said, moving toward the door. He stepped in front of me, and for the first time, I got a close look at his hands. The fingernails were long and yellowed, more like claws than human nails. Dark stains covered his fingers and forearms, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Ain't nothing for you down there," he repeated, his voice carrying a new edge. "Step aside." For a moment, we stood frozen in a tableau of confrontation. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching us from the shadows, waiting to see how this would play out. The man's breathing had become audible, a low rasping sound that reminded me unpleasantly of an animal's growl. Then he smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Your choice," he said, stepping aside. "But some doors are better left closed." I opened the door and found myself staring down into absolute darkness. The smell that rose from below was indescribable, a mixture of human waste, rotting meat, and something else. Something that smelled like fear itself, if fear had an odor. Pulling out my flashlight, I started down the wooden stairs. The basement was a cathedral of nightmares. My flashlight beam swept across a space much larger than the cabin above could have contained, as if the structure extended deep into the mountain itself. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slick with moisture that reflected my light in twisted patterns. But it was what occupied the space that made my hands shake. Cages. Dozens of them, constructed from rusted metal and reinforced with heavy chains. Most were empty, their doors hanging open like hungry mouths, but the evidence of recent occupation was everywhere. Scratches in the metal where fingernails had worn themselves to nothing. Dark stains on the stone floors. Piles of discarded clothing that looked like they'd been cut away from bodies. And in the far corner, barely visible in the darkness, a single occupied cage. I approached slowly, dreading what I might find. The figure huddled inside was barely recognizable as human, emaciated, filthy, covered in cuts and bruises that spoke of prolonged abuse. But when he looked up at my flashlight beam, I saw the spark of intelligence still burning in his eyes. Jesse Connors. Alive, but only just. "Oh God," I whispered, kneeling beside the cage. "We're getting you out of here." His voice was barely a croak. "Too late. They're coming back. They're always coming back." The lock on his cage was simple enough, an old padlock that I could probably shoot off without too much risk. But as I examined it, I became aware that we were no longer alone in the basement. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. They knew I was trapped down here. They knew I had nowhere to run. "There are others," Jesse whispered urgently. "They take us one by one. Feed us to the thing in the deep caves. Make us part of it." I turned to see 3 figures descending the stairs, moving with the patience of predators who knew their prey was cornered. The man from upstairs was in the lead, but now I could see his companions clearly for the first time. A woman with wild gray hair and skin covered in ritual scars. Her eyes were completely white, as if cataracts had claimed her sight, but she moved with the confidence of someone who could see perfectly well in the darkness. Behind her came a younger man, maybe in his 30s, whose most disturbing feature was his smile. It never wavered, never changed expression, as if it had been carved into his face and left there permanently. His clothes were stained with substances I didn't want to identify. "Put him down," the first man said, his voice carrying a new authority. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." I had my gun out, aimed at his center mass. I understand plenty. You're under arrest for kidnapping and assault. The woman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Your laws don't reach here, little badged man. This place belongs to older authorities. Maybe so, I said, but my bullets still work the same. I fired a warning shot, aiming high. The sound was deafening in the confined space, echoing off the stone walls like thunder. But none of them even flinched. Go ahead, the first man said, his filed teeth gleaming in my flashlight beam. Won't do you any good. We've been blessed by the hunger. Made part of something greater. I aimed for his shoulder and fired. The bullet hit him square in the joint, spinning him around and spraying blood across the stone wall. But instead of falling, he straightened up and turned back toward me, his smile never wavering. The wound was already beginning to close. What the hell are you? I breathed. We are the chosen, the woman said, her blind eyes somehow finding mine in the darkness. Selected to feed the old hunger that sleeps beneath these mountains. And you will be the next offering. The younger man had begun to circle around me, moving with inhuman grace. Up close, I could see that his fingernails had been replaced with metal claws that gleamed in the flashlight beam. I shot him in the leg, watched him stumble, then watched in horror as he kept coming. Dark blood poured from the wound, but he showed no signs of pain or weakness. The forest chose us long ago, the first man explained conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather. Gave us strength, purpose. Made us part of its endless appetite. And in return we feed it. Fresh meat. Young blood. The fear and pain of the innocent. He gestured toward the empty cages around us. You're standing in a buffet, detective. Every cage has held a meal. Every occupant has eventually found their way into the deeper caves, where the true hunger waits. How many? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dozens over the years. The woods provide, and we harvest. Students from the university mostly, young, strong, full of life force. But occasionally we get something special. His eyes fixed on me with predatory interest. A lawman. Someone with authority and purpose. The forest particularly enjoys those. Jesse had managed to pull himself closer to the bars of his cage. Run, he whispered urgently. There are tunnels. Deep caves. Something lives down there. Something old. I could hear it now, a sound like breathing, but far too large to be human. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if the mountain itself was drawing breath. The sound of something ancient and patient, waiting to be fed. You hear it, the woman said with satisfaction. The old hunger, stirring in its sleep. It's been waiting for you, Kurt Linder. Yes, we know your name. The forest whispered it to us when you entered the trees. The metal claws scratched against stone as the younger man positioned himself behind me. I was surrounded, outgunned, and facing opponents who apparently couldn't be killed by conventional means. But I'd noticed something they might have overlooked. The breathing from the depths grew louder, more insistent, as if something massive was slowly awakening. The sound seemed to emanate from cracks in the stone floor, suggesting a vast network of caverns beneath our feet. Whatever lived down there was responding to our presence, drawn by the scent of fresh blood and the promise of new meat. You feel it calling, don't you? The scarred woman whispered, her blind eyes rolling back in ecstasy. The old hunger that predates your civilization by millennia. It was here when the mountains were young, feeding on mammoth and direwolf. Now it feeds on whatever we provide. I kept my gun trained on them while edging toward Jesse's cage, but my attention was drawn to something else I'd noticed, a set of keys hanging from the first man's belt. Not just keys to the cage, but something older. Tarnished metal symbols that looked like they might fit into the carved patterns on the walls. What's your name? I asked the leader, buying time while I planned our escape. Names are for the living, he replied. But I was once called Ezra. Before the forest claimed me. Before I understood my true purpose. And what purpose is that? To feed the hunger. To keep the old compact alive. He gestured toward the walls, where the carved symbols seemed to pulse with their own internal light. My grandfather brought our family to these woods in 1953. Thought he was escaping civilization, building a better life. But the forest had other plans. The younger man with the permanent smile had moved closer, his metal claws clicking against the stone. When he spoke, his voice was sing-song, childlike. Grandfather found the caves first, he said. Heard the calling in his dreams. Saw the symbols in the smoke of his campfire. The hunger showed him what it needed, and grandfather was happy to provide. Starting with his own family, the woman added. His wife went first. Then his children, one by one. Fed to the thing below until only grandfather remained. But the hunger was pleased. It made him strong. Made him last. Made him ours. I could see the story in the empty cages around us. Decades of victims, each one lured to this place and offered to whatever lived in the depths. Students, hikers, runaways, anyone who wouldn't be immediately missed. A systematic feeding program that had gone undetected for generations. Why Jesse? I asked, still working my way closer to his cage. Young. Strong. Full of potential energy. Ezra explained. The hunger prefers them that way. Fear gives the meat a particular flavor that older prey lacks. Jesse whimpered at these words, pressing himself against the back of his cage. I could see bite marks on his arms and legs, not from animals, but from human teeth. They'd been feeding on him gradually, keeping him alive while they consumed him piece by piece. But you, the woman said, focusing her blind gaze on me with uncomfortable precision. You're something special. Authority figures carry a different kind of energy. The power to command, to inspire fear in others. The hunger finds that delicious. The breathing from below was getting stronger, more rhythmic. Whatever was down there was definitely waking up, responding to the presence of fresh prey. I could feel vibrations in the stone floor, as if something massive was moving in the depths. That's when I saw my chance. The symbols on the walls weren't just decorative. They were functional. Pressure plates, possibly, or some kind of primitive locking mechanism. And if Ezra's keys were what I thought they were. Tell me about the old hunger, I said, hoping to keep them talking. What exactly lives down there? Ezra's filed teeth gleamed as he smiled. Older than memory. It was here before the first humans crossed the land bridge, feeding on whatever the continent provided. When the forests were young and the world was wild, it gorged itself on giant prey and slept for decades between meals. But humans were different, the woman continued. Humans brought consciousness, intelligence, the capacity for complex fear. The hunger developed a taste for our particular essence. Our capacity for hope made the eventual despair so much sweeter. So it made a compact with my grandfather, the younger man sang. Feed me, and I'll make you strong. Bring me fresh meat, and I'll give you long life. Serve me faithfully, and I'll share my power. The keys at Ezra's belt caught the light from my flashlight, and I could see that they weren't really keys at all. They were metal recreations of the symbols on the walls, designed to fit into specific slots. A locking mechanism that controlled something important. What happens if you stop feeding it? I asked. It feeds on us instead, Ezra said simply. The compact is binding. We provide, or we become the meal ourselves. The ground shook again, more violently this time. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and I could hear the sound of stone cracking somewhere in the depths. Whatever was down there was definitely waking up, and it was big. I made my move. Lunging forward, I grabbed the keys from Ezra's belt while simultaneously shooting out the lock on Jesse's cage. The kid was weak, but adrenaline got him moving. We had seconds before they recovered from their surprise. The symbols! Jesse gasped as I pulled him from the cage. The wall symbols! They control the barriers! Looking closer at the carved patterns, I could see what he meant. Some of the symbols were actually covers for keyholes, designed to blend seamlessly with the decorative carvings. And if they control barriers... Another massive vibration shook the basement, and this time I heard something else. The sound of stones sliding against stone, as if massive doors were opening somewhere in the depths. It's coming, the woman whispered in ecstasy. The old hunger rises to greet its new meal. I could see movement in the darkness beyond my flashlight beam. Something pale and massive, pulling itself up from depths that seemed to extend forever into the mountain's heart. The breathing sound was getting closer, accompanied by the wet slithering of something that had never been meant to walk upright. Using Ezra's keys, I started jamming them into every symbol slot I could find, turning them at random, hoping one of them would seal whatever passage the thing was using to reach us. The cultists rushed toward me, but their inhuman strength meant nothing if I could trap their master below. One of the keys fit, turned with a grinding sound, and somewhere in the depths, I heard the crash of falling stone. The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the breathing had been. In the absence of that rhythmic sound, every small noise became amplified: the drip of water from the ceiling, Jesse's labored breathing, the soft shuffle of the cultists' feet as they realized what I'd done. "You don't understand," Ezra said, his voice carrying a note of panic for the first time. "The barriers aren't to keep it down there. They're to keep other things from getting to it. Bigger things. Hungrier things." Before I could process what he meant, the mountain shook again, not from something rising, but from something massive impacting the stone far above us. The ceiling cracked, raining debris that suggested the entire structure was under assault. "What's up there?" I demanded, but the cultists had gone silent, their faces turned upward in terror. Another impact, closer this time. Through the cracks in the ceiling, I could see starlight, which meant whatever was attacking had already torn through the cabin above us. Jesse grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "We have to get out," he whispered urgently. "There are other tunnels. Other ways out. But we have to move now." The woman with the scarred face was backing toward the stairs, her blind eyes wide with fear. "It knows," she moaned. "It knows we've failed. It's calling the sky hunger down on us." I didn't know what she meant by sky hunger, but I wasn't planning to stick around to find out. Supporting Jesse with one arm, I started toward a passage I noticed in the far wall, partially concealed behind hanging roots and carved symbols. "That leads to the old mines," Ezra called after us. "You'll be lost in there. Die in the dark. Better than dying here," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and carved directly from the living rock. Jesse's flashlight, which I'd somehow managed to keep during the confrontation, revealed rough tool marks in the stone, suggesting this tunnel was much older than the basement we'd just left. Behind us, I could hear the cultists arguing in harsh whispers, debating whether to follow us or flee to the surface. Their decision was made for them when another massive impact shook the mountain, and this time, pieces of the ceiling began to fall. "Move!" I shouted, pushing Jesse ahead of me into the tunnel. The passage sloped downward at first, then leveled out into what had clearly once been a mining operation. Rusted tracks ran along the floor, and support beams showed the marks of pickaxes and explosives. But there were other marks too, the same symbols I'd seen throughout the cabin, carved into every available surface. "They've been here for generations," Jesse gasped as we stumbled through the darkness. "The mining was just a cover. A way to dig deeper, get closer to the thing below." The tunnel branched repeatedly, creating a maze that could easily trap the unwary. But Jesse seemed to know where he was going, turning left and right with the confidence of someone who'd memorized the route. "How do you know the way?" I asked. "They brought us down here before," he replied, "to show us what would happen if we tried to escape. Some of the passages lead back to the surface. Others," he shuddered, "others lead to feeding chambers. Places where they prepare the offerings." We passed several of these chambers, and I tried not to look too closely at what they contained. Tables with restraints. Tools that belonged in a butcher shop, not a mine. Walls painted with substances that were definitely not rust. The sounds of destruction were getting closer, following us through the tunnels. Whatever was attacking the mountain was tearing through the upper levels systematically, working its way down toward us. "What did Ezra mean about sky hunger?" I asked as we hurried through a particularly narrow section. "There are others," Jesse panted. "Other old things. The thing below isn't the only one. He told me about them while he was cutting on me," said their territorial. "They don't like sharing hunting grounds." The implications hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just dealing with one ancient predator, we were caught in the middle of a territorial dispute between cosmic horrors. And we were the smallest, most vulnerable things in the area. Behind us, I could hear pursuit now. The cultists had decided to follow rather than face whatever was tearing apart their sanctuary above. But they knew these tunnels better than we did, and their inhuman endurance gave them an advantage in a long chase. "How far to the surface?" I asked. "Half a mile, maybe more. But we have to cross the cathedral chamber first." "Cathedral chamber?" Jesse's face went pale in the flashlight beam. "You'll see." We emerged from the narrow tunnel into a vast cavern that defied geological possibility. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet above us, supported by natural stone pillars that had been carved into intricate spirals. But it was the floor that made my breath catch. Bones. Thousands upon thousands of bones, arranged in careful patterns that suggested religious significance. Not just human bones, though there were plenty of those, but the remains of creatures I couldn't identify. Things with too many limbs, or skulls shaped like nothing that should have existed on Earth. "The feeding ground," Jesse whispered. "This is where they bring the offerings. Where the thing below comes to collect its meals." A path wound through the bone garden, marked by posts topped with fresh human skulls. We had no choice but to follow it, trying not to think about the things that crunched under our feet. Halfway across the chamber, the pursuit caught up with us. Ezra emerged from the tunnel behind us, moving with inhuman speed. The bullet wounds I'd given him had healed completely, leaving only torn fabric as evidence they'd ever existed. His filed teeth gleamed in the darkness as he bounded across the bone field like a predatory animal. "You cannot escape your purpose," he howled. "The old compact must be fulfilled." I turned and fired, aiming for center mass. The bullet took him in the chest, spinning him around, but didn't slow him down for more than a few seconds. Whatever transformation the forest had worked on him, it had made him virtually indestructible. But it hadn't made him immune to physics. Using my last few rounds, I shot out one of the carved pillars near the tunnel entrance. The ancient stone, already weakened by decades of carving, cracked and began to topple. Ezra leaped aside, but not quickly enough to avoid the cascade of rocks that followed. The tunnel behind us collapsed with a roar that echoed through the cavern like thunder. We'd bought ourselves time, but at the cost of our only known route back to the surface. "There's another way," Jesse said, pointing toward the far end of the chamber. "But it's not going to be easy." The path led to what looked like a natural chimney in the rock, rising at a steep angle toward distant starlight. Iron rungs had been hammered into the stone, creating a primitive ladder that climbed hundreds of feet toward the surface. "Up there?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Up there." We started climbing. The ascent was a nightmare of aching muscles and vertigo. Jesse, weakened by his captivity, could barely pull himself from rung to rung. I had to support most of his weight, while fighting my own exhaustion and the growing conviction that we'd never reach the top. But the worst part was the sounds from below. The destruction had reached the cathedral chamber, and whatever was causing it had found the bone garden. The sounds that echoed up the chimney defied description: wet tearing noises, the crack of massive jaws, roars of rage that suggested the sky hunger had finally encountered its underground rival. We climbed faster. By the time we reached the surface, dawn was breaking over the Bitterroot Mountains. We emerged from a hidden cave mouth half a mile from the original cabin site, gasping in the clean morning air like drowning men who'd found shore. Behind us, the mountain shuddered one final time, and then fell silent. I radioed for backup as soon as we reached a clearing with reception, but when the response team arrived, they found no trace of the cabin or its occupants. The entire area had been scoured clean, as if some massive force had wiped the slate completely blank. Jesse spent 6 months in therapy before he could talk about what had happened in detail. Even then, his account was fragmented, confused, mixing memories of genuine horror with trauma-induced hallucinations. The official report listed the case as solved, victim recovered, suspects fled, but I knew better. The truth was written in the scars on Jesse's arms, in the symbols I'd seen carved into living wood, in the impossible architecture of the chambers beneath the mountain. Something ancient lived in the Bitterroot wilderness, something that had been feeding on human prey for generations. And now something even worse had come to challenge its dominion. I transferred out of Montana 6 months later, but I still follow the missing persons reports from the region. The numbers have gone down significantly since 1999, which should be encouraging. Instead, it terrifies me. Because if the Skyhunger won that territorial dispute, if it claimed the Bitterroot as its new feeding ground, then the old compact Ezra spoke of might still be in effect. The mountain still needs to be fed. And sooner or later, something will have to take the cultist's place as the provider of fresh meat. The thought keeps me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind. Because sometimes, when the mountains call in my dreams, I think I hear my name echoing from the depths. And I wonder if I'll be strong enough to resist when the hunger finally comes for me. I grew up in a cramped downtown apartment in Ironbridge, where every car horn and dog bark seeped through thin walls like water through tissue paper. The neighbors upstairs had a baby that cried at 3 in the morning, every morning, and the couple next door fought about money until their voices became white noise. Sleep came in fragments, if at all. Out here in the wilderness, there was nothing but the crunch of gravel trails underfoot, the sigh of wind steering through branches, and the ache of long hikes that reminded me I still had a body worth inhabiting. I thought solitude was exactly what I needed, until I wasn't so sure anymore. The ranger position had seemed like salvation when I'd applied 6 months ago, fresh off a divorce that had carved out my insides and left me hollow. Sarah had taken the apartment, the car, even the houseplants I'd never cared about until they were gone. "You need space to figure yourself out," she'd said, her voice gentle but final. She wasn't wrong. The city had become a cage of familiar disappointments, every street corner holding memories I wanted to forget. The trail to my cabin started 2 miles down from the ranger station, a weathered building that smelled of coffee grounds and old wood. It wound along a gentle slope, trees bending overhead like cathedral arches, shading the switchbacks in green so thick it felt like walking underwater. I walked that path every day, same distance, same landmarks, same ritual of signing out at dusk and heading home. An oak with a split trunk that looked like a cracked open book, its pages frozen mid-turn. A mossy log sagging beside a creek that burbled quietly, the sound barely audible over my footsteps. An old stone fire pit ringed with flat rocks someone had arranged ages ago, back when people still came to this part of the forest. They were small markers, unremarkable in daylight, but after a week they'd become as familiar as the freckles on my hands. I didn't even need to look anymore. My boots settled into the familiar rhythm, left, right, left, the leather worn soft from daily use. Sometimes I'd catch myself counting steps, 437 to the split oak, 612 to the creek, 894 to the fire pit. Numbers grounded me, gave structure to the formless hours between sunrise and sunset. The trail felt predictable, comforting in the way routine does when everything else in your life has shifted beyond recognition. I knew exactly how long the walk should take, 43 minutes on a good day, 47 if I stopped to rest by the creek. I knew the precise angle of afternoon light that would hit the cabin's porch at 4:30. I knew the way the boards creaked under my weight, which steps squeaked, where to place my key in the lock so it wouldn't stick. Then, one evening, everything shifted. I signed off at the station as dusk fell on Wednesday, August 6th, the date clear in my memory because I'd been counting down to my first full month on the job. The air hung still, heavy with the promise of rain that never came. The forest hushed around me as if holding its breath. I tucked my worn logbook into my pack, the same spiral-bound notebook I'd used since training, its pages filled with neat entries about trail conditions and visitor counts, and headed out as usual. My legs carried me forward in steady rhythm, left, right, left. The familiar weight of my pack settled between my shoulder blades. I passed the split oak, its bark scarred by lightning from some long-ago storm. The creek gurgled its evening song. The fire pit waited in its clearing like an ancient altar. Everything looked exactly as it should, yet something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. When I glanced at my watch partway through the walk, my chest tightened with a fear so sudden it left me breathless. The little digital numbers glared back, 90 minutes. I should have reached the cabin 40 minutes ago. I should have been sitting on the porch, boots off, watching the last light fade between the trees. Instead, I was still walking, still counting steps that seemed to multiply with each footfall. My legs burned, not from climbing, the trail was mostly flat, but from steps taken too many times, like I'd been going in circles on a treadmill that never stopped. The trail didn't look different. I passed the same oak, the same log, the same fire pit, their positions unchanged, their details exact. Yet the walk just kept stretching, elastic and impossible, like a bad dream where you run toward a door that never gets closer. My boots kept crunching on gravel that should have run out hours ago. The forest kept enveloping me in its familiar embrace, but the end, my cabin, my sanctuary, never came. My mind spun, thoughts tangling like fishing line. Was I lost? That seemed impossible on a trail I'd walked 27 times without incident. Was I sick? Having some kind of breakdown? The divorce had been hard, but not hard enough to make me lose my grip on reality. Was the trail shifting behind me, rearranging itself like a puzzle box designed to trap the unwary? When the cabin finally emerged from between the trees, wooden siding tucked into the slope, windows dark, porch dim in the failing light, I felt relief flood through me like cold water, only to drain away just as quickly when I really looked at what I was seeing. Something was wrong. I stopped a few feet from the steps and stared, my pack suddenly feeling heavy enough to drag me into the earth. I'd helped measure and cut those boards just 2 weeks earlier, working alongside Seth, the maintenance supervisor who'd trained me during my first week. We'd been methodical, precise, checking each measurement twice before making any cuts. The steps had been laid in straight lines, snug and uniform, each board level with its neighbors. Now one step sagged at a slant, visibly shorter than the rest. The nails protruded at odd, careless angles, rust blooming around their heads like dried blood. Whoever or whatever had changed it hadn't cared about precision or permanence. It looked slapped together, hurried, the work of someone who wanted the job done quickly and didn't mind if it fell apart later. My throat tightened as I climbed the uneven steps, the wonky board shifting under my weight with a groan that sounded almost organic, like bone bending near its breaking point. I walked inside, muscles aching from the impossible journey, and dropped my pack on the kitchen table with more force than necessary. The sound echoed in the small space, too loud for such a simple action. Then I froze. The logbook wasn't there. I unzipped every compartment of my pack with increasingly frantic movements, checked the interior lining where things sometimes slipped, even tipped the bag upside down, and shook it until my spare socks and energy bars scattered across the wooden floor. My fingers trembled as I searched, first methodically, then desperately. Nothing. The logbook had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. A sick certainty crept through my chest as I glanced over my shoulder toward the main room. There it was, sitting calmly on the shelf by the east wall, spine aligned perfectly with the edge of the wood. Clean. Closed. Positioned as if it had always belonged there, as if this had been its home since the cabin was built. A single pine needle lay across its brown cover, delicate and precisely placed, like a bookmark made of forest debris. I hadn't left it there. I was certain of that with the kind of bone-deep knowledge that comes from repetition and routine. I always kept the logbook in my pack until the next morning, when I'd review the previous day's entries over coffee. Always. It was part of my evening ritual, as fixed as brushing my teeth or checking the lock on the door. The front door. I spun around and saw it standing slightly ajar, a gap of perhaps 3 inches letting in the night air. I distinctly remembered closing it behind me. The memory was clear, immediate, untainted by doubt. The old brass knob required a firm twist to catch properly, and I'd done it without thinking, muscle memory taking over. I rushed to the door and pulled it shut, the latch clicking with a sound that seemed too final. Then I turned back to the logbook, approaching it like it might bite. When I opened the cover, a shiver that had nothing to do with temperature crawled up my spine. The handwriting was mine, but wrong. It was like looking at my signature in a funhouse mirror, recognizable but distorted, familiar yet alien. The letters slanted at angles I never used, the loops in my G's and Y's compressed into shapes that looked almost deliberate in their imperfection. Someone had studied my handwriting carefully enough to mimic the basic forms but hadn't understood the rhythm, the natural flow that comes from years of practice. The entry described my walk from the station in detail that made my skin crawl. It mentioned leaving at 4 o'clock, though I distinctly remembered checking my watch as I locked the station door, 7:15 p.m., the numbers glowing green in the gathering dusk. It noted a rest stop by the split oak, complete with observations about the bark patterns and the way the evening light filtered through the damaged trunk. I hadn't stopped once during that endless walk. I'd been too unsettled, too focused on reaching the cabin, to pause for anything. The entry even mentioned checking my watch and noting the perfect 43-minute timing, followed by a satisfied comment about the predictability of routine. But my watch had shown 90 minutes of impossible walking, not the familiar 43. Whoever had written this, whoever had used my own hand to document a walk I'd never taken, had gotten every detail wrong while making it sound perfectly, terrifyingly right. I snapped the book shut and locked the door, something I'd never done before in 3 weeks at the cabin. The click of the deadbolt seemed to echo longer than physics should allow. Then I crossed to the back room, intending to check the window I always left cracked for ventilation. It sat wide open. Not just unlatched, but pushed up as far as the old frame would allow, the screen removed and leaning against the interior wall. Night air flowed through the opening, carrying scents of pine and something else, something organic and unpleasant that reminded me of meat left too long in summer heat. My stomach dropped as I stared at the gap. I never left that window open. Never. The cabin was isolated enough that basic security measures had become second nature, drilled into me during training by Seth, whose paranoia about break-ins had seemed excessive until this moment. I slammed the window shut and twisted the latch until my knuckles went white. Then I sat down hard on the edge of the bed, springs creaking in protest, and tried to let the silence settle around me. The familiar sounds of the cabin at night, the settling wood, the whisper of wind through eaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like a soundtrack to a horror film, each creak and rustle potentially hiding something worse. My pulse gradually slowed as rational thoughts attempted to return. Maybe fatigue had made me misremember the details. Maybe I'd been half asleep during the walk, my mind playing tricks after too many days of solitude and routine. Maybe stress was manifesting in ways I didn't understand, causing me to sleepwalk through tasks I thought I remembered clearly. But I hadn't been asleep. I remembered every moment of that impossible walk with crystalline clarity, the growing awareness that something was wrong, the mounting panic as minutes stretched into an hour and beyond, the relief and terror of finally seeing the cabin emerge from the trees. Midnight came and went while I sat there, staring at the walls and trying to convince myself that everything had a logical explanation. Then I heard it. A heavy knock at the front door. Single. Solid. Deliberate. Not the scattered, urgent hammering of someone in trouble. I'd helped stranded hikers before, and their knocks were quick, desperate, human in their panic. This was slow, measured, patient. It had weight behind it, as if the person on the other side knew exactly how much force to use for maximum effect. My heart lurched against my ribs like a caged animal. I froze on the bed, barely breathing, waiting to see if I'd imagined it. Minutes passed in absolute silence. Then a second knock came. Same weight. Same deliberate pace. Same terrible patience. Then a third, after another long pause. All evenly spaced. All exactly the same in timbre and force, as if produced by a machine designed for the sole purpose of creating that specific sound. It wasn't someone seeking help or trying to wake me. The knocking had an inevitability to it, like the tolling of a church bell marking time no one wanted to measure. This wasn't someone who needed me to open the door. Maybe they just wanted me to know they were there, standing patient in the darkness, waiting for something I couldn't begin to understand. I didn't move at first. Every instinct screamed at me to stay exactly where I was, to become as still and silent as possible, to maybe disappear entirely if I just held my breath long enough. But something deeper than instinct, some primal part of my brain that had kept my ancestors alive when things with teeth came calling in the night, told me I needed to know what was out there. I pulled the hatchet off the bedside table where I'd placed it on my first night, more as a comfort than from any real expectation of needing it. The weathered wooden handle felt solid and cool in my palm, its weight reassuring in a way that made my racing heart slow by perhaps a single beat per minute. I crept toward the front door, bare feet silent on the old floorboards, and pressed my eye to the peephole. Nothing. Just the deck, gray in the moonlight, fading into the forest darkness beyond. The knocker had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. I yanked the door open anyway, hatchet raised, adrenaline making my hands shake. The clearing was empty. No figure disappearing into the trees, no movement in the shadows, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I leaned outside, scanning the blackness between the trunks, straining to catch any hint of motion or sound. Not a rustle. Not a footstep. Not even the normal night sounds that should have filled the silence. No all calls, no insect chirping, no small animals rustling through undergrowth. The forest had gone completely quiet, as if every living thing was holding its breath and waiting. I stooped and checked the porch boards by flashlight, looking for any sign of disturbance. They looked untouched, the thin layer of pine pollen that had settled during the day still perfectly even, undisturbed by footfalls or any other presence. It was as though the person who had knocked possessed no physical substance, leaving no more trace than a ghost. I backed inside and shoved the kitchen table against the door, its legs scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on wood. Then I sat down in the room's only chair, clutching the hatchet across my knees, and stared at the barricaded entrance. Every creak in the cabin walls sounded like a footstep. Every groan from the settling wood made me flinch and tighten my grip on the weapon. The familiar sounds of an old building cooling in the night air had transformed into a symphony of potential threats, each one making me imagine figures moving just beyond the walls, circling the cabin like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. I stared at the door, waiting for the knocking to resume, but nothing came. The silence stretched and deepened until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the cabin, crushing the air from my lungs and making every breath feel insufficient. Dawn came eventually, pale and quiet, seeping through the windows like weak tea. I pushed the table away from the door with trembling hands and stepped outside, hatchet still gripped tight enough to leave impressions in my palm. Something had changed. The ground around the porch looked different now, disturbed in ways that daylight made impossible to ignore. There were prints, not the clean, defined impressions of hiking boots or sneakers, but something else entirely. Large, bare footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, each one showing the clear outline of 5 toes and a broad, flat sole. But these weren't normal human feet. They were too big, for one thing, easily size 14 or 15, longer and wider than any foot should be. The impressions were deep enough to suggest enormous weight, far more than even a large person should carry. And there was something wrong with the shape, a subtle wrongness that made my eyes want to slide away from the details. I followed the trail with growing unease. 10 prints total, arranged in a rough semicircle around the front of the cabin, each one positioned as if the owner had been standing there for hours, shifting weight from foot to foot but never actually walking anywhere. They started about 6 feet from the porch and ended the same distance away, forming an arc that encompassed the entire front of the building. Then they stopped. No trail leading into the forest. No additional prints showing departure or approach. It was as if their maker had simply materialized at the edge of the circle, stood vigil through the night, then vanished into thin air when dawn broke. I knelt beside the clearest print, the one closest to the door, and studied it with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for car accidents. The impression was so deep it had to have been made by someone standing absolutely still for a long time, weight concentrated in one spot until the earth gave way. But the edges were too clean, too precisely defined, as if the foot that made it had no calluses, no scars, no individual wear patterns that marked it as belonging to a specific person. It looked more like a mold than a natural footprint, as if someone had carved the perfect representation of a human foot and pressed it into the earth with mechanical precision. A memory surfaced unbidden, Seth, during my second week on the job, mentioning stories the older rangers told about things in the deep woods. "People go missing sometimes," he'd said while we repaired a section of trail bridge. "City folks mostly, the ones who don't understand that wilderness isn't just nature, it's everything nature used to be before we pushed it back into the dark places." I'd laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to the kind of tall tales that accumulated around isolated places like moss on stone. Now, staring at prints that shouldn't exist, I wondered what else Seth might have been trying to warn me about. The rational part of my mind still fought for control, offering explanations that grew more desperate with each passing second. Maybe it was a prank, some locals with plaster molds and a twisted sense of humor. Maybe it was a escaped mental patient with unusual feet and perfect balance. Maybe it was anything at all, except what it obviously was. But the prints were real. They were there in the dirt, clear as photographs, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Something had stood outside my cabin for hours, patient and still, waiting for reasons I couldn't begin to imagine. I didn't wait to think about it further. I didn't try to solve the mystery of the shifted step, the impossible handwriting, the crooked boards that had been straight just hours before. I just grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and locked the cabin door out of reflex rather than any belief that locks would keep out whatever had been watching me. The trail back to the station felt longer than usual, each step echoing louder than it should, reminding me with every crunch of gravel that I was not alone in these woods anymore. Maybe I never had been. The ranger station sat exactly where it should, solid and reassuring in the morning light, but even its familiar bulk couldn't entirely dispel the dread that had settled in my chest like cold water. I set my pack down on the steps and tried to act normal, tried to become the person I'd been just 24 hours earlier, but normal was a country I could no longer find on any map. Seth's truck was already in the parking area, its familiar blue paint job and collection of bumper stickers marking it as surely as a signature. He'd be inside, making coffee and reviewing the maintenance schedule, following his own morning routine that had probably remained unchanged for the 15 years he'd worked these woods. I needed to talk to someone. I needed another human being to look at me and confirm that I was still present in the world, that I hadn't somehow slipped into one of those spaces between spaces where normal rules stopped applying. The door's cowbell announced my entrance with its cheerful jangle, a sound that belonged to a universe where footprints made sense and trails had consistent lengths. Seth looked up from his desk, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips, and I saw something flicker across his face. A momentary tightening around his eyes that might have been recognition or concern or something else entirely. "You look like hell," he said, setting down the mug with deliberate care. "Rough night?" I almost laughed at the massive inadequacy of that description. "You could say that. Seth, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me a straight answer." He leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the kind of attention usually reserved for accident scenes. "Shoot. Those stories you told me about people going missing in the deep woods. How much of that was real?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a dangerous fire. Seth's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle stiffening that told me he'd been expecting this conversation eventually. "Depends what you mean by real," he said finally. "People do go missing. That's statistical fact. Hiking accidents, getting lost, animals, weather. Mountains kill people every year in boring, predictable ways. That's not what you were talking about before." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug in slow circles on the desk surface. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to the tone people use for discussing things they'd rather not discuss at all. "How long you been at the cabin now? 3 weeks? Almost 4. And everything's been normal until recently?" The way he phrased it, not asking if things had been normal, but assuming they'd been normal until recently, made my skin crawl. "How did you know something was wrong?" Seth stood and walked to the window overlooking the parking area, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier at parade rest. Because it always starts the same way. The trail gets longer. Things get moved around. Someone starts paying attention to you, but not in any way that makes sense. My mouth went dry. Someone? The rangers who've worked here long enough, we call it the listener. Because that's what it does first, it listens. Watches. Learns your patterns, your habits, your routine. Figures out how you think and move and exist in its space. Its space? Seth turned from the window, his face grave in a way that made him look older than his 50-something years. You think we mapped all of this wilderness? You think we put trails through every square mile and cataloged every tree and stream? There are places in these mountains that don't appear on any map, places that exist in the gaps between the places we know about. I wanted to dismiss this as folklore, the kind of campfire stories that grew larger with each retelling. But the memory of those impossible footprints, of the trail that had stretched beyond all reason, made the dismissal stick in my throat like a bone. The listener comes from one of those gap places, Seth continued. Maybe it always lived here and we just built our trails too close to its territory. Maybe we disturbed something that was supposed to stay buried. Doesn't matter. What matters is that once it starts paying attention to someone, it doesn't stop. What does it want? Near as we can figure? It wants to understand. Human behavior, human patterns, human existence. It watches and copies and tries to figure out how we work. But it's not human, so it gets the details wrong. Like a child playing dress-up in clothes that don't quite fit. The memory of my own handwriting, wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, made my hands tremble. The logbook. Someone wrote in my logbook, but it was my handwriting. Sort of. Seth nodded grimly. It studies you. Learns to mimic you. But it doesn't understand the deeper patterns, the unconscious habits that make you who you are. So the mimicry is always just a little off, like a photograph taken through dirty glass. How many people has this happened to? In the 15 years I've been here? 7. 3 managed to transfer to other stations before things got too bad. 2 quit outright and moved to different states. 1. Seth paused, running a hand through his graying hair. 1 insisted on staying, said he wasn't going to be driven off by some backwoods superstition. We found his truck at the trailhead about a month later. Never found him. And the 7th? Seth's eyes met mine with an expression that made my blood turn to ice water. The 7th was my partner, Jim. Happened about 3 years ago. He started reporting the same things you're dealing with, the trail changing length, items being moved, sounds at night. I tried to convince him to transfer, but he was stubborn. Said he'd been in these woods longer than whatever was messing with him. What happened to him? He changed. Gradually at first, then faster. Started talking differently, moving differently. Like something was wearing him as a disguise but couldn't quite figure out how to make it fit properly. One morning I came to work and found him sitting at his desk, but when I looked closer, it wasn't really him anymore. Just something that looked like him and remembered some of his words. My chest felt tight, as if the air in the station had become too thick to breathe properly. Where is he now? Still around. Sometimes I see him on the trails, always at a distance, always just far enough away that I can't be completely sure it's him. But it never approaches, never tries to communicate. Just watches from the tree line and disappears when I get too close. The implications of this hit me like a physical blow. You're saying this thing doesn't just watch people. It replaces them. I'm saying I don't know what it does exactly. But I know that when it's done studying someone, that someone isn't quite the same person anymore. Maybe they're still in there somewhere, maybe they're not. Maybe it matters, maybe it doesn't. I thought about the footprints around my cabin, the patient vigil of something that could stand motionless for hours without leaving normal human traces. I thought about my logbook filled with entries I'd never written in handwriting that was almost but not quite my own. How long do I have? Seth's expression was answer enough, but he spoke anyway. Jim lasted about 6 weeks from the first incident to the change. But it's different for everyone. Some people it studies for months before making its move. Others it gets bored with quickly and just fades away. And some people it replaces. Yeah. Some people it replaces. I should have left immediately. Should have thrown my belongings into my truck and driven until the mountains were just a memory in my rearview mirror. Should have heeded Seth's warning and the evidence of my own senses that something malevolent had taken an interest in my existence. Instead, I went back to the cabin. Maybe it was stubbornness, the same trait that had kept me in my marriage long past its expiration date, the same inability to quit that had gotten me through college and boot camp and every other challenge I'd refused to let break me. Maybe it was simple disbelief, some part of my rational mind still insisting that there had to be a logical explanation for everything I'd experienced. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe by then, the listener had already begun its work on me, planting thoughts and impulses that felt like my own but served its purposes instead. The trail back to the cabin felt different that evening. Not longer this time, but wrong in ways that were harder to define. The familiar landmarks were all in their proper places, the split oak, the mossy log, the ancient fire pit, but they looked somehow staged, like props arranged by a set designer who'd studied photographs but never seen the real thing. The oak's split seemed too perfectly symmetrical. The moss on the log grew in patterns too regular to be natural. The stones around the fire pit had been arranged with mathematical precision that no casual camper would have bothered to achieve. It was as if something had rebuilt the entire trail from memory, copying every detail it could remember but lacking the understanding to reproduce the subtle imperfections that mark these things as real rather than reproductions. When I reached the cabin, I found the door standing open. Not just unlocked, wide open, as if welcoming me home. I approached cautiously, hatchet in hand, but the building appeared empty. My pack sat on the kitchen table exactly where I'd left it that morning. The logbook rested on its shelf, closed and peaceful. Everything looked normal. Too normal. I stepped inside and immediately noticed the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of an isolated cabin, but a complete absence of sound that felt oppressive and unnatural. No settling wood, no whine through the eaves, no distant animal calls. Even my own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself had become dense and sound-absorbing. The logbook drew my attention like a magnet. I opened it with trembling fingers and found a new entry, written in my handwriting but describing a day I'd never lived. August 7th, routine patrol of sectors 4 through 7. Weather clear, temperature pleasant. Encountered hiker near mile marker 12, provided directions to water source. Discussed local wildlife and trail conditions. Hiker seemed experienced and well prepared. No incidents to report. Trail conditions excellent throughout. Beautiful day to be in the wilderness. Sometimes I think I could stay out here forever. The final line made my skin crawl. I'd never written anything like that, would never express such sentiment in an official log. But the handwriting was mine, not the imperfect mimicry I'd seen before, but an exact reproduction that captured every quirk and habit of my penmanship. Someone had been practicing. I was about to close the book when I noticed something else. The page was damp. Not wet, exactly, but slightly moist, as if the ink hadn't quite dried despite clearly having been written hours earlier. When I touched the paper, my finger came away with a faint residue that felt organic and unpleasant. A sound from the back room made me freeze, a soft rustling, like fabric moving against fabric. I crept toward the noise, hatchet raised, heart hammering against my ribs. The bedroom appeared empty, but the window I'd sealed shut the night before stood open again, screen removed and leaning against the wall. Cool air flowed through the gap, carrying with it that same unpleasant organic smell I'd noticed before, stronger now and sickeningly sweet. But it was what I saw in the mirror above the dresser that made my legs nearly give out from under me. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that might have been a trick of fading light, I saw two reflections. My own face, pale and frightened, and behind it, slightly offset like a double exposure, another face that was almost identical but wrong in ways my conscious mind couldn't process. The same features, the same bone structure, the same hair and eyes and general proportions. But the expression was different, patient and predatory and utterly alien, like a wolf that had learned to smile but couldn't quite remember how the expression was supposed to work. I spun around, but nothing was there. The room was empty except for shadows that seemed deeper than they should be, darker than the failing light could account for. When I looked back at the mirror, only my own reflection stared back, wide-eyed and terrified. But I knew what I'd seen. The listener had been studying me, copying me, learning to wear my face like a mask. And from the perfect reproduction of my handwriting in the logbook, it was nearly ready to complete its work. I grabbed my pack and ran. The trail felt endless again, but this time I didn't care about the distance, or the impossibility of it. I just ran, crashing through branches and stumbling over roots, driven by a primal terror that something was following me. Something that looked like me, moved like me, thought like me, but wasn't me in any way that mattered. Behind me, I could hear footsteps matching my pace exactly, never getting closer but never falling behind. When I was forced to stop for breath, the footsteps stopped too. When I resumed running, they resumed as well, maintaining that constant, impossible distance. I didn't look back. Some instinct older than civilization warned me that seeing what pursued me would break something in my mind that could never be repaired. The ranger station appeared ahead like a beacon, its lights warm and welcoming in the growing darkness. I burst through the door, gasping and wild-eyed, and found Seth waiting for me with an expression of grim sympathy. "It's starting the final phase," he said without preamble. "How much time do you think you have?" "I don't know. It was in the cabin, in the mirror. It looked exactly like me." Seth nodded, unsurprised. "Then you need to leave. Tonight. Don't go back for anything, don't stop to pack, don't worry about your job or your lease or anything else. Just get in your truck and drive until you're at least 3 states away." What about nothing? This isn't a negotiation or a problem you can solve. It's a predator that's decided you're its next meal, and your only chance is to get far enough away that it loses interest. I wanted to argue, to insist that there had to be another way, but the memory of that alien face wearing my features killed the words in my throat. "What if it follows me?" "It might. But distance seems to weaken its connection to people. Get far enough away fast enough, and it usually moves on to easier prey." "Usually?" Seth's expression darkened. "Jim tried to run. Made it almost to Denver before he stopped being Jim. But he waited too long, gave it too much time to study him. You might have better luck." I was already moving toward the door when Seth called out again. "One more thing. If you see anything that looks like you in the next few weeks, in mirrors, in photographs, in other people's descriptions, don't acknowledge it. Don't react to it. Don't give it any indication that you recognize what it's trying to do. Sometimes that's enough to make it lose interest." I nodded and stepped outside, then paused. "Seth? What if I don't make it far enough?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the dark bulk of the mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Then maybe someday I'll see you on the trails, just far enough away that I can't be sure it's really you. And I'll do what I've always done when I see Jim. I'll look the other way and pretend I didn't notice anything at all." I drove through the night, pushing my truck harder than I'd ever pushed it before, radio turned up loud to mask any sounds that might be coming from the road behind me. In the rearview mirror, I occasionally glimpsed what looked like another vehicle maintaining a steady distance. But whenever I tried to focus on it, the headlights would vanish as if they'd never been there at all. I made it to Utah before exhaustion forced me to stop. Found a cheap motel and paid cash for a room, then spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair by the window, watching the parking lot for any sign of movement. Dawn brought no relief. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked wrong, not obviously different, but off in ways I couldn't articulate. The proportions seemed slightly altered, the expressions not quite matching my actual emotions. When I smiled, the reflection smiled back a fraction of a second too late. I broke the mirror with a coffee mug and checked out immediately. 3 weeks later, in a different state entirely, I got a call from the ranger service. They'd found my truck at the bottom of a ravine near the cabin, the caller said. Appeared I'd driven off the road during a night trip, probably fell asleep at the wheel. My body hadn't been recovered, but given the terrain and the local wildlife, that wasn't unusual. The caller expressed sympathy for the tragic accident and asked if I had any next of kin who should be notified. I hung up without answering. The listener had gotten tired of waiting. It had decided to become me officially, to take over my life completely rather than just copying pieces of it. Somewhere in those mountains, something that looked exactly like me was living in my cabin, working my job, being me more perfectly than I ever could. And I was nobody at all. I've been running for 6 months now, staying in cheap motels and paying for everything in cash, never staying in one place long enough to establish any kind of routine that could be studied and copied. Sometimes I catch glimpses of myself in mirrors or reflective surfaces, but I never know if what I'm seeing is really me or something else wearing my face. The worst part isn't the running or the isolation or the constant fear. The worst part is the growing certainty that it doesn't matter how far I go or how carefully I hide. The listener has already won. It learned everything it needed to learn during those nights outside my cabin, studied me with enough patience and precision to become a perfect copy. Maybe I'm the real one and the thing in the mountains is just an imitation. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe there never was a difference to begin with, and the person I thought I was never really existed at all. I don't know anymore. I can't know. All I can do is keep running, keep moving, keep hoping that distance and time will eventually break whatever connection binds me to that patient thing in the woods. But late at night, when the motel rooms are quiet and the darkness feels absolute, I sometimes hear knocking at my door. 3 knocks, evenly spaced. Patient and deliberate, and exactly the same. And I know that someday, when I'm too tired to run anymore, I'm going to open that door and find myself standing on the other side. The real question isn't whether that day will come. The real question is whether I'll still be me when it does.